Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin stares out from a photograph taken in the winter of 1928, his thick mustache shadowing a mouth that never quite smiled. His eyes, dark and unreadable beneath heavy brows, seemed to calculate something beyond the camera's frame, something the photographer could not capture. In that image, his right hand rests against the edge of a desk cluttered with papers, and if you look closely, you can see the fingers are tense, almost clenched. This was not a man at peace with the world. This was a man at war with reality itself. The Soviet Union was freezing in more ways than one. The vast industrial dream that Lenin had promised and Stalin had inherited was starving for the tools of modernity. Across the border, in America and Germany, factories hummed with turbines and assembly lines, churning out steel beams and tractors and electrical generators. The West had everything the Bolsheviks needed to drag Russia out of the mud and into the 20th century. But there was a problem, cold and insurmountable. The West wanted payment in gold, and the Soviet treasury was nearly empty. The mines of the Urals could not keep pace with the appetite of ambition. Every grain of bullion went toward purchasing another lathe, another locomotive, another piece of the puzzle that would build socialism. It was never enough. Inside the Lubyanka, the headquarters of the OGPU, the secret police that controlled the Soviet Union's shadows, men in dark uniforms gathered in rooms without windows. They smoked cheap cigarettes and drank bitter tea, and they discussed problems that had no elegant solutions. The year 1928 was slipping into 1929, and the 5-year plan was already choking on its own promises. How do you industrialize a nation when the currency of the world refuses to flow into your hands? How do you buy the future when the present holds you hostage? Someone in one of those smoke-filled meetings asked a question that should never have been asked aloud. What if we simply made the dollars ourselves? It sounded like madness. It sounded like the fever dream of a desperate gambler staring at an empty wallet. But desperation has a way of making the impossible seem logical. The United States dollar was the language of global commerce, the key that unlocked every door. If the Soviet Union could not earn it and could not steal enough of it, then perhaps, just perhaps, it could forge it. Not crude imitations that a shopkeeper would spot in an instant, but perfect replicas, indistinguishable from the genuine article. Bills so flawless that they would pass through the hands of bankers, industrialists, and treasury officials without raising a single eyebrow. It was counterfeiting on a scale that had never been attempted, a financial act of war disguised as legitimate trade. The idea moved upward through the secret channels of the OGPU, climbing the ladder of power until it reached the very top. And at the top sat Stalin, the man who did not believe in impossibilities, only in obstacles that required the right amount of pressure to crack. He listened to the proposal with the same expression he wore in that photograph, calm, calculating, revealing nothing. The risks were enormous. If the operation failed, if the forgeries were discovered, the Soviet Union would be branded a pariah, a rogue state that violated the most sacred rules of international finance. But if it succeeded? If the fake dollars flooded into the global market undetected, then the Soviet Union could buy its future with paper and ink, and the capitalists would never know they had been robbed in broad daylight. Stalin gave his approval. Not with fanfare, not with speeches or decrees, but with a quiet nod in a quiet room. The wheels began to turn. Somewhere in the depths of Moscow, in a building that did not officially exist, technicians and chemists and master engravers were summoned. They were told that they would be working on a project of the highest national importance, a project that required absolute secrecy and absolute precision. They were not told why. They were not told the full scope of what they were creating. They were simply told to make the perfect American $100 bill, and to make it so well that even God himself could not tell the difference. Operation Dollar had begun. The Soviet Union was about to commit the greatest financial crime in history, and the world would not realize it until the money was already in circulation, until the machines were already built, until the future was already purchased with a lie. The building had no name, no address that appeared on any official map. It stood in a quiet district of Moscow, disguised as a warehouse for agricultural supplies, and no one who passed by its gray walls would have guessed what happened inside. Behind reinforced doors and guards who asked no questions, the OGPU had constructed something between a laboratory and a temple. This was where the impossible would be made real, where the forgery would be born. The American $100 bill was not just paper and ink. It was a small masterpiece of engineering designed over decades to resist the very crime the Soviets were about to commit. The paper itself was the first problem, a blend of cotton and linen fibers that gave the genuine bill its distinctive texture, crisp yet flexible, with a particular weight and sound when snapped between fingers. Soviet paper mills produced newsprint and propaganda posters, not currency-grade material. The OGPU sent agents to textile factories across Eastern Europe seeking the exact composition. They stole samples from banks in Paris and Vienna, analyzing them fiber by fiber under microscopes. Chemists worked through the night, testing ratios, burning through batch after batch until they finally achieved something close to the American formula. But close was not enough. Stalin's orders were absolute. The counterfeit must be perfect. Then came the ink. American currency used a specific shade of green, a color so carefully guarded that the Bureau of Engraving and Printing kept its formula locked in vaults. The Soviets had no access to that formula, so they had to reverse engineer it from stolen bills. Teams of chemists broke down the pigments, identifying traces of chromium and iron oxides, mixing compounds in endless variations. The green had to match under daylight, under lamplight, under the scrutiny of bank tellers who handled thousands of bills every day. Too bright, and it would scream forgery. Too dark, and suspicion would bloom like a stain. The margin for error was microscopic, and every failure brought the project closer to disaster. But paper and ink were only the foundation. The true soul of the dollar lived in its engravings, the intricate portraits, the delicate scroll work, the tiny lines that required the steady hand of a master. The OGPU scoured the underworld for talent, dragging in the finest forgers from the criminal networks of Moscow, Leningrad, and beyond. They found men who had counterfeited Tsarist rubles before the revolution, artists who could reproduce a banknote with such fidelity that only an expert could detect the fraud. But these criminals were not enough. The OGPU also reached into the past, locating elderly engravers who had once worked in the Imperial Mint, men whose hands remembered the old techniques. They were brought to the secret facility under guard, given tools and magnifying glasses, and told to replicate the portrait of Benjamin Franklin with such precision that every wrinkle, every strand of hair would be identical to the original. The work was maddening. A single stroke too heavy, a line too thin, and the entire plate would be ruined. The engravers worked under intense lighting, their eyes straining, their fingers cramping, knowing that failure might mean more than professional disappointment. In Stalin's Soviet Union, failure on a state project could be interpreted as sabotage, and sabotage carried a bullet to the back of the head. The pressure was suffocating, but it produced results. Slowly, painstakingly, the plates began to take shape, capturing the essence of the American bill. Security around the operation was absolute. The engravers and chemists lived in dormitories attached to the facility, cut off from the outside world. Their letters were censored, their movements tracked, their conversations monitored. No one was allowed to know the full scope of the project. Each person worked on a single piece of the puzzle, ignorant of how it fit into the larger picture. Only a handful of OGPU officers understood that they were preparing to flood the global market with fake dollars. The rest simply followed orders, believing they were serving some vague national interest. Stalin received regular updates. Samples of the counterfeit bills were brought to the Kremlin in locked briefcases, laid out on his desk for inspection. He examined them with the eye of a jeweler studying diamonds, holding them up to the light, running his fingers over the surface, comparing them side by side with genuine American currency. He demanded adjustments, sharper lines here, a slightly different shade there. Nothing escaped his scrutiny. He understood that the entire operation hinged on this deception being flawless. If the forgeries were detected, the consequences would ripple far beyond embarrassment. The Soviet Union would be exposed as a criminal state, and the dream of industrialization would collapse under the weight of scandal. But if the forgeries were perfect, if they slipped unnoticed into the veins of global commerce, then the Soviet Union would have discovered the ultimate weapon, the power to print its own reality, to bend the rules of the capitalist world without breaking them visibly. And so the work continued, day after day, month after month, until the first batch of counterfeit $100 bills emerged from the presses, indistinguishable from the real thing, ready to be unleashed upon an unsuspecting world. Berlin in 1929 was a city that had learned to live with contradictions. On the surface, it sparkled with jazz clubs and cabarets, with fashionable women in furs and businessmen in tailored suits. Beneath that glittering veneer, it rotted with inflation scars, political violence, and a hunger for foreign currency that made people willing to overlook uncomfortable questions. The mark had been wounded by hyperinflation, and trust in paper money was fragile. But dollars? American dollars were as good as gold, perhaps better. They opened doors that no other currency could touch. This made Berlin the perfect city for what the Soviets needed to do next. The private banking house of Sass and Martini occupied an elegant building on a respectable street, the kind of address where wealth whispered rather than shouted. The brass nameplate outside gleamed with polish, and the interior smelled of leather and cigars. Clients who entered were greeted by clerks in starched collars, men who spoke in soft voices and handled transactions with the discretion of priests taking confession. The bank's reputation was impeccable. They specialized in international currency exchange, facilitating trade between East and West, moving money across borders with the efficiency that only a neutral intermediary could provide. Or so it seemed. In truth, Sass and Martini had made a deal with the devil, though they likely rationalized it as simply good business. The Soviets had approached them through intermediaries, carefully vetted agents who posed as legitimate businessmen with connections to Moscow trade offices. The proposal was straightforward. The bank would accept deposits of American dollars and convert them into marks, francs, or pounds as needed. The commissions would be generous, far above the standard rate. No questions would be asked about the origin of the currency, and no records would be kept beyond the minimum required by German law. For a bank operating in the shadows of Weimar's chaotic financial system, it was an offer too lucrative to refuse. The mechanics were simple but brilliant. Counterfeit $100 bills, fresh from the secret Moscow presses, were transported to Berlin through diplomatic pouches and smuggling routes that the OGPU had spent years developing. They arrived in bundles, wrapped in plain paper, indistinguishable from any other parcel. Once in Berlin, they were carefully integrated into the bank's operations. A bundle of fake bills would be sandwiched between layers of genuine currency, creating a stack that appeared completely legitimate. When clients came to exchange dollars for other currencies, they might receive a mix of real and counterfeit notes, or the fake bills would be used in wire transfers and settlements with other banks. The forgeries slipped into circulation like poison into a water supply, spreading slowly, undetected. Sass and Martini became the laundering mechanism for Stalin's financial crime. The bank's respectable facade provided the perfect cover. Who would suspect that a well-established German institution was helping the Soviet Union flood the market with counterfeit currency? The clerks who handled the transactions likely had no idea what they were touching. Only the senior partners knew the truth, and they were compensated well enough to keep their consciences quiet. Every month, thousands of fake dollars passed through the bank's accounts, converted into legitimate currency, and sent to Swiss banks, French financial houses, and American trading companies. The money was clean by the time it left Berlin, its origins scrubbed by the alchemy of banking. The beauty of the scheme was its simplicity. The Soviet Union could use the counterfeit dollars to purchase machinery, steel, and technology from Western companies. Those companies, in turn, would deposit the dollars in their own banks, and by the time anyone examined the bills closely, the trail would be cold. The forgeries were so perfect that most passed through multiple hands before anyone noticed anything unusual. And even then, the assumption would be that a single counterfeiter was at work, not a state-sponsored operation backed by the resources of the OGPU. Berlin became the lung through which Stalin's fake dollars breathed into the world economy. The city's position at the crossroads of Europe made it ideal for moving money in all directions. From Sass and Martini, the counterfeit currency spread westward to Amsterdam and Paris, eastward to Vienna and Prague, and across the Atlantic to New York and Chicago. The network was vast and diffuse, impossible to trace back to its source. The Soviets had not just created perfect forgeries. They had created a distribution system that made detection nearly impossible. But perfection is fragile, and systems built on lies carry the seeds of their own destruction. In the shadows of Berlin's banking district, in the quiet transactions that no one thought to question, the operation hummed along smoothly. For now. The counterfeit dollars were indistinguishable from the real thing. The bank was loyal, and the money flowed like a river. But rivers can flood, and floods always leave evidence behind. Somewhere in the machinery of global finance, a crack was beginning to form, a tiny fissure that would eventually bring the entire operation crashing down. The Atlantic Ocean was wide, but money has always found ways to cross water. Berlin could launder the counterfeit dollars, could scrub them clean enough to fool most bankers, but the real challenge was pushing them deep into the American economy where they could do the most good. Respectable financial institutions moved slowly, kept records, asked questions that the Soviets preferred not to answer. What Stalin's operation needed was a distribution network that operated outside the law, that dealt in cash and asked no questions, that could absorb thousands of fake $100 bills and spread them across the American landscape like seeds in fertile soil. They needed criminals. Prohibition had turned the United States into a paradise for organized crime. By 1929, the gangsters who controlled bootlegging, gambling, and narcotics had built empires that rivaled legitimate corporations in size and sophistication. They moved millions of dollars through underground channels, bribed police and politicians, and operated with an efficiency that would have impressed any Soviet commissar. The syndicates needed constant infusions of cash to grease palms, pay enforcers, and expand operations. They were perfect partners for what the OGPU had in mind, even if neither side particularly trusted the other. The connections were made through intermediaries who existed in the gray zone between the legal and illegal worlds. Soviet trade representatives in New York maintained contact with Russian émigrés who had fled the revolution but still had family ties back home. Some of these émigrés had drifted into the American underworld, working as fixers, smugglers, and middlemen for the Italian and Jewish crime syndicates that dominated the eastern seaboard. Through these contacts, quiet meetings were arranged in smoky back rooms, in basements beneath restaurants, in private clubs where the law never ventured. The pitch was simple. The Soviets had access to high-quality counterfeit American dollars, virtually undetectable. The gangsters could purchase these bills at a discount, say 80 cents on the dollar, and use them as if they were genuine. Everyone made money, and no one got caught. Chicago became a particularly fertile ground for the operation. The city was a war zone in the late 20s, with Al Capone's organization fighting bloody turf battles against rival gangs. Cash was power, and power was survival. When OGPU agents offered to supply counterfeit hundreds through trusted channels, certain elements within the Chicago underworld jumped at the opportunity. The fake bills arrived in small batches, smuggled in along with legitimate shipments of furs and machinery from European ports. They were distributed through gambling houses and speakeasies, paid out to corrupt officials, used to purchase guns and trucks and warehouses. The beauty was that no one questioned where a gangster got his money. Cash was cash, and in the world of illegal liquor and underground casinos, paper currency changed hands so quickly that tracking its origin was impossible. New York offered even more opportunities. The city was the financial capital of the world, with banks on every corner and millions of transactions happening daily. The Soviet counterfeit dollars filtered into the economy through multiple channels. Some were used by gangsters to pay for legitimate businesses, restaurants, dry cleaning services, taxi companies that served as fronts for their illegal operations. Others were mixed into the take from gambling dens and numbers rackets, bundled with real money and deposited in banks by men who appeared to be successful businessmen. The bills moved through the system like ghosts, leaving no trail, raising no alarms. The alliance between Soviet intelligence and American organized crime was never formalized, never written down, never acknowledged by either side. It existed in whispers and handshakes, in cash-filled suitcases passed across tables in dimly lit rooms. The gangsters didn't care about Stalin's 5-year plan or the glory of socialism. They cared about profit margins and territorial control. The OGPU agents didn't care about bootlegging or prostitution rings. They cared about converting worthless paper into real industrial machinery. But for a brief, strange moment in history, Bolshevik revolutionaries and American criminals found common cause, united by greed and the shared understanding that money, real or fake, was the only language that truly mattered. The operation worked because both sides needed it to work. The gangsters got cheap dollars that spent like real ones, giving them an edge in the cutthroat world of organized crime. The Soviets got their counterfeit currency distributed so widely and so quickly that tracing it back to Moscow became nearly impossible. By the time a fake bill might raise suspicion in a New York bank, it had passed through dozens of hands: a speakeasy owner, a corrupt cop, a legitimate shopkeeper, a factory payroll office. The paper trail was so tangled that no investigator could follow it to its source. But every criminal enterprise contains the seed of its own destruction, and this one was no different. The more successful the operation became, the more fake dollars flooded into circulation, the greater the chance that someone, somewhere, would notice that something was not quite right. And in the spring of 1930, in a bank on the corner of a busy New York street, that someone finally did. By the spring of 1930, the counterfeit dollars had become invisible. They had merged so completely with the genuine currency that even experienced bankers could not tell them apart. In Moscow, the industrial planners watched with quiet satisfaction as American machinery arrived on Soviet docks, purchased with paper that had been printed in secret facilities beneath the capital. Turbines from General Electric, tractors from International Harvester, steel rolling equipment from Pittsburgh foundries, all paid for with Stalin's dollars. The irony was exquisite. The capitalist world was selling the tools of its own system to the communists and accepting fake money in return without the slightest suspicion. American industrialists were thrilled to do business with the Soviet Union. The Depression was beginning to cast its shadow across the United States, and orders from Moscow represented real revenue at a time when domestic demand was shrinking. Soviet trade delegations arrived in Detroit and New York with briefcases full of cash, ready to sign contracts worth millions. They negotiated like professionals, inspected factories, demanded quality guarantees, and paid promptly. The dollars they offered looked genuine, felt genuine, and spent like genuine currency. No one thought to examine them too closely. Why would they? The Soviet Union was a customer, not a criminal. The scale of the operation was staggering. Conservative estimates suggest that several $1 million in counterfeit currency entered circulation between 1929 and 1930. That may not sound enormous by modern standards, but in the context of the time, it represented a significant fraction of Soviet foreign trade. The fake bills paid for engineers who traveled to Moscow to teach Soviet workers how to operate new machinery. They funded shipments of chemical equipment, electrical generators, and precision instruments. Every dollar that left Soviet hands came back in the form of industrial capacity, the building blocks of a modern economy. The system was self-reinforcing. American companies deposited the Soviet dollars in their own banks, and those banks used them in regular financial operations, clearing checks, settling accounts with other institutions, making loans to customers. The counterfeit bills dispersed through the banking system like dye in water, spreading out until they were diluted beyond detection. A fake $100 bill might start in a Soviet trade office in New York, get deposited in a Michigan bank after purchasing factory equipment, then be withdrawn by a businessman in Chicago, spent at a department store in Philadelphia, and eventually end up in the cash register of a grocery store in Boston. By that point, tracing it back to Moscow was impossible. The operation worked because it exploited a fundamental assumption of the global financial system, that money is honest. Banks operated on trust, on the belief that the paper passing through their hands was genuine unless proven otherwise. The Soviets had understood this weakness and weaponized it. They had created a perfect lie, one so convincing that the entire architecture of international commerce accepted it without question. It was financial judo, using capitalism's own weight against itself. Inside the Kremlin, Stalin received reports that must have pleased him immensely. The forged dollars were purchasing everything the Soviet Union needed to industrialize at breakneck speed. The first 5-year plan, which had seemed impossibly ambitious, was suddenly achievable. Factories were rising in the Urals and Siberia. Power stations were generating electricity. Tractors were rolling off assembly lines. And a significant portion of this transformation was being funded by paper and ink, by the careful work of engravers and chemists who had turned worthless materials into American currency. There was a dreamlike quality to the success, a sense that the Soviets had discovered a cheat code for the global economy. They had printed their own future, literally. Every fake $100 bill represented real machinery, real technology, real progress. The capitalists, so certain of their superiority, so confident in the sanctity of their currency, had been duped on a scale they could not imagine. And the beauty of it was that they were complicit in their own deception, happily accepting payment that validated their belief in the power of the dollar, while never suspecting that the power had been stolen. But no secret this large can remain buried forever. The counterfeit operation was like a pressure cooker, sealed tight, building force with every transaction. The bills were perfect, the distribution network was efficient, and the cover-up was thorough. Yet somewhere in the vast machinery of American banking, a single imperfection was waiting to reveal itself. One wrong serial number, one suspicious texture, one clerk who looked twice instead of once. That was all it would take. And in a bank in New York, as winter gave way to spring in 1930, that moment was fast approaching. The day was ordinary in every way that mattered. March winds rattled the windows of the Chase National Bank on Lower Broadway, and inside, the familiar rhythm of commerce hummed along without interruption. Tellers counted bills, clerks processed deposits, and customers waited in lines that moved with predictable efficiency. It was a Tuesday, mid-morning, and the bank was busy but not overwhelmed. No one expected anything unusual to happen. No one was looking for trouble. His name has been lost to history, this nameless clerk who changed everything. Perhaps he was young, recently hired, still possessing the nervous attention to detail that years of routine would eventually dull. Or perhaps he was a veteran, someone who had handled so many bills that his fingers could read them like Braille, sensing variations too subtle for conscious thought. What matters is that on this particular morning, as he processed a routine deposit from a textile importer, something made him pause. The bill was a $100 note, crisp and clean, part of a stack that appeared entirely legitimate. Benjamin Franklin stared out from the portrait with his usual bemused expression, and the green ink seemed perfectly matched to every other bill the clerk had handled that day. The paper felt right, the weight was correct, and the serial number was properly formatted. There was no obvious reason to suspect anything wrong. Yet something nagged at the edges of his perception, a whisper of wrongness that he could not quite identify. He held the bill up to the light, examining the watermark. It looked fine. He ran his thumb across the surface, feeling for the slightly raised texture of genuine engraving. That felt fine, too. He compared it side by side with another $100 bill from the same stack, and visually they were identical. But the feeling would not go away, that subtle instinct that something was not quite right. He set the bill aside and continued processing the deposit, but his mind kept returning to it. During his lunch break, he went back to examine the bill more carefully. This time, he noticed something that made his stomach tighten. The serial number. He pulled out another $100 bill from a different transaction, one he was certain was legitimate, and compared the serial numbers. They were different, as they should be. But then he remembered processing a similar deposit the previous week from a different customer. He went to the archived records, pulled the documentation, and felt a chill run down his spine. The serial number on the suspicious bill matched the bill that had passed through the bank 7 days earlier. That should have been impossible. Every American bill has a unique serial number, a fingerprint that ensures no two notes are exactly alike. Finding two bills with identical serial numbers meant one of two things. Either there had been a catastrophic error at the Bureau of Engraving and Printing, or one of the bills was counterfeit. The clerk brought his discovery to his supervisor, a gray-haired man who had worked in banking for 20 years and had seen his share of forgeries. The supervisor examined both bills, his expression growing increasingly serious. He sent for the branch manager. Within an hour, 3 men were standing around a desk, staring at what appeared to be 2 identical $100 bills, both perfect in every detail, except for the one detail that damned them. The manager made a phone call to the bank's security department. They made a phone call to the Secret Service, the federal agency responsible for investigating counterfeiting. By late afternoon, 2 agents in dark suits were sitting in a conference room examining the bills under magnifying glasses and ultraviolet lights. They tested the paper, analyzed the ink, studied the engraving with the intensity of surgeons examining a patient, and slowly, reluctantly, they came to a conclusion that seemed almost impossible. These were not crude forgeries knocked out in some basement workshop. These were masterworks created by someone with access to extraordinary resources and expertise. The discovery sent ripples outward. Other banks were contacted, asked to review their recent deposits for any irregularities. Within days, more duplicate serial numbers were found, then more after that. The pattern was alarming. The counterfeit bills were not concentrated in one location or one type of transaction. They were everywhere, diffused through the banking system like a virus that had been spreading undetected for months. The scale of the operation was becoming clear, and it was far larger than anyone had imagined. What had started as one clerk's nagging suspicion on an ordinary Tuesday morning was rapidly turning into a financial scandal that would reach the highest levels of government. The perfect operation, the invisible flood, the brilliant deception that had worked flawlessly for over a year, all of it was unraveling because of a detail so small that it should have been irrelevant. 2 bills with the same serial number. That was all it took. That was the crack in the dam, and now the water was beginning to pour through. The whispers started on Wednesday morning. Bank managers across Manhattan received quiet phone calls from colleagues, cryptic conversations that avoided specifics but conveyed urgency. Something was wrong with the $100 bills. Check your deposits. Look for duplicate serial numbers. By noon, the whispers had become murmurs, and by the closing bell, they had become a roar that echoed through the marble halls of Wall Street's financial temples. The Chase National Bank discovery was not an isolated incident. It was the tip of an iceberg. By Thursday, the Secret Service had established a command center in a government building near Federal Hall. Agents worked around the clock, coordinating with banks across the city, then across the state, then across the nation. The telegrams flew like frightened birds, carrying the same urgent message. Examine your currency reserves. Report any irregularities immediately. The responses that came back were alarming. Banks in Boston found duplicate serial numbers. Philadelphia reported suspicious bills. Chicago discovered dozens of questionable hundreds in recent deposits. The geographic spread was vast and seemingly random, which only deepened the mystery. Treasury Department officials gathered in emergency meetings, their faces drawn with worry. This was not the work of a small-time counterfeiter operating out of a garage. The quality of the forgeries was too high, the distribution too widespread, the operation too sophisticated. Someone with significant resources and technical expertise had flooded the American market with fake currency, and they had done it so skillfully that the deception had gone undetected for over a year. The implications were staggering. If the bills were this good, how many more were still in circulation, passing through banks and businesses without raising any alarms? The Secret Service began pulling bills from circulation for testing, examining them with every tool available. What they discovered was terrifying in its perfection. The paper matched the government formula almost exactly. The ink was chemically identical to the genuine article. The engravings were so precise that only under high magnification could tiny imperfections be detected, and even then, those imperfections might be attributed to normal wear rather than forgery. Whoever had created these bills had access to information that should have been impossible to obtain, resources that suggested state-level backing. That realization changed everything. The investigation shifted from a criminal matter to a question of national security. If a foreign government was behind this operation, then what America faced was not mere counterfeiting, but an act of economic warfare. The bills were weapons designed to undermine confidence in the dollar, to destabilize the banking system, to fund hostile operations on American soil. But which government? Who had the motive, the capability, and the audacity to attempt something so brazen? Suspicion naturally fell on the Soviet Union. By late March, investigators had traced some of the counterfeit bills back through several hands to businesses that dealt with Soviet trade representatives. The connections were tenuous, circumstantial, but suggestive. American intelligence agencies began compiling reports on Soviet financial activities, looking for patterns, anomalies, anything that might confirm what was becoming an increasingly plausible theory. The communists needed hard currency desperately, everyone knew that. And the Soviets had certainly demonstrated a willingness to break international norms when it suited their purposes. But proving Soviet involvement was another matter entirely. The bills had been laundered through so many intermediaries that establishing a direct link to Moscow seemed impossible. The diplomatic channels buzzed with carefully worded inquiries, and the Soviet responses were predictably indignant. Suggestions that the USSR would engage in counterfeiting were dismissed as anti-communist propaganda, provocations designed to damage legitimate trade relationships. The denials were vehement, and without hard evidence, American authorities could not push the accusations further. Meanwhile, the panic was spreading beyond government offices. Rumors leaked to newspapers, and soon the public was reading alarming headlines about sophisticated counterfeit currency flooding the market. Businesses became paranoid, examining every $100 bill with suspicion. Some merchants refused to accept large denominations altogether, preferring smaller bills that were less likely to be fake. The confidence that underpinned the entire monetary system was beginning to crack. If you could not trust a $100 bill, what could you trust? The economic impact was immediate. The Federal Reserve quietly began recalling suspicious bills, but the process was slow and created its own problems. Legitimate businesses found themselves holding currency that banks would not accept, losing money through no fault of their own. The volume of counterfeit bills in circulation was estimated at several $million, enough to cause serious disruption, but not enough to collapse the system entirely. It was a perfectly calibrated attack, large enough to cause damage, but not so large that it would trigger immediate catastrophic failure. By April, the investigation had reached an impasse. The authorities knew they were dealing with high-quality state-sponsored forgeries, almost certainly Soviet in origin, but they could not prove it conclusively. The trail led to Berlin, to suspicious banking houses and immigrant networks, but there it went cold, buried under layers of plausible deniability and diplomatic immunity. The counterfeit operation had been brilliantly designed, and now it was being brilliantly concealed. The dam had cracked, but the flood could not be traced back to its source. Not yet. The American investigation could only go so far on its own soil. But the Treasury Department and Secret Service had counterparts across the Atlantic, and by late April of 1930, those counterparts were becoming very interested in certain activities in Berlin. German authorities, under pressure from their American allies and concerned about their own financial reputation, began quietly examining transactions at several private banking houses. One name kept appearing in the reports: Sass and Martini.
On a gray morning in early May, German police and financial investigators gathered in a nondescript office 3 blocks from the bank. They reviewed their evidence: suspicious currency exchanges, unusually large dollar deposits from Soviet-connected clients, and patterns that suggested systematic money laundering. The case was not airtight, but it was strong enough for a warrant. At precisely 9 o'clock, as the bank was opening for business, the authorities moved in.
The raid was swift, but not subtle. Uniformed officers blocked the exits while plainclothes investigators swept through the offices demanding access to records and safes. The clerks and junior employees looked bewildered, genuinely shocked by the invasion. But the senior partners, the men who knew what secrets the bank held, reacted with barely controlled panic. One of them, a heavy-set man named Martini, tried to reach a telephone before being intercepted by a detective. Another moved toward a back office where documents were stored, only to find his path blocked by armed police. The investigators knew what they were looking for: evidence of counterfeit currency transactions, correspondence with Soviet agents, records that would prove the bank's complicity in the operation. What they found exceeded their expectations. In a locked safe behind a painting in Martini's private office, they discovered bundles of American $100 bills, some bearing the duplicate serial numbers that had triggered the entire investigation. More damning still were the ledgers, meticulously kept records of currency exchanges that clearly showed the bank accepting far more American dollars than any legitimate business relationship with Soviet clients could explain. But the most valuable evidence was still being hidden even as the raid unfolded. In a basement office, a junior partner named Sass was frantically feeding documents into a furnace used to heat the building. The papers burned quickly, turning into ash and smoke that rose through the chimney. He had almost completed the task when 2 detectives burst through the door, drawn by the smell of burning paper. They pulled him away from the furnace, but it was too late to save much of what had been destroyed. The charred remains suggested correspondence, possibly with Moscow, possibly with intermediaries who had facilitated the counterfeit operation. The arrests came quickly.
Sass and Martini were taken into custody, along with 3 other bank officers who appeared to have direct knowledge of the scheme. Their protests of innocence were unconvincing, contradicted by the physical evidence found in their own offices. Within hours, the story was leaked to the press. Headlines screamed about a major counterfeiting scandal. German bankers in league with Soviet agents, a financial crime that had fooled institutions on 2 continents. The comfortable facade of respectability that Sass and Martini had cultivated for years crumbled in a single morning. Under interrogation, the bankers provided pieces of the puzzle, though never the complete picture. They admitted to handling large currency transactions for Soviet clients, but claimed ignorance about the counterfeit nature of the bills. They described intermediaries, men with Russian accents and diplomatic credentials who had offered lucrative commissions in exchange for discretion. The bankers painted themselves as naive businessmen who had been deceived, though the evidence suggested they had known exactly what they were doing and had been paid handsomely for their silence. The raid on Sass and Martini provided the direct link that American investigators had been seeking. The paper trail, though partially destroyed, showed clear connections to Soviet trade offices in Berlin and Moscow. Currency that had been identified as counterfeit in New York banks could now be traced backward through the German institution to its probable source. The operation was exposed, the distribution network compromised, and the diplomatic implications were explosive. But even as the Berlin connection collapsed, The masterminds in Moscow remained untouchable, protected by diplomatic immunity and the walls of the Soviet state. The OGPU officers who had orchestrated the operation were never named in the German investigation.
The engravers and chemists who had created the perfect forgeries remained anonymous, locked away in facilities that did not officially exist. Sass and Martini would face trial and imprisonment, scapegoats for a conspiracy that reached far beyond their comfortable banking house on a respectable Berlin street. The raid marked the beginning of the end for Operation Dollar. The mechanism had been exposed, the supply chain disrupted, and the international community was now fully aware that the Soviet Union had attempted to undermine the global financial system. But awareness is not the same as accountability, and the Kremlin was already preparing its response. Total, absolute, shameless denial. News of the Berlin raid reached Moscow within hours, carried through diplomatic cables and intelligence networks. In the Lubyanka, senior OGPU officers gathered in emergency session, reviewing the damage and calculating their next moves. The operation that had worked so brilliantly for over a year was now compromised, exposed by a combination of bad luck and inevitable human error. But exposure did not mean admission. In Stalin's Soviet Union, reality was whatever the state declared it to be, and the state had no intention of confessing to anything. The official response was swift and indignant. Soviet diplomats in Berlin, London, and Washington issued strongly worded statements condemning the accusations as anti-Soviet propaganda, a malicious campaign designed to damage legitimate trade relationships between the USSR and Western nations. The suggestion that the Soviet government would engage in counterfeiting was characterized as absurd, insulting, and politically motivated. The capitalist press, they claimed, was inventing scandals to justify its hostility toward the workers' state. If counterfeit American currency had appeared in Europe, surely that was the work of criminal elements, not a sovereign government. The denials were delivered with such conviction that they almost seemed plausible. Soviet Foreign Minister Maxim Litvinov personally addressed the matter in a speech, his voice dripping with wounded dignity. He spoke of the USSR's commitment to international law, its respect for financial norms, and its desire for peaceful economic cooperation. The accusations, he insisted, were fabrications intended to sabotage Soviet-American trade at a time when both nations could benefit from commerce. It was a performance worthy of a trained actor, and it worked remarkably well in sowing doubt among Western audiences who wanted to believe that their own governments might be exaggerating the threat. Behind the diplomatic theater, the cleanup operation was already underway. In the secret facility where the counterfeit dollars had been printed, technicians worked methodically to erase every trace of the operation. The engraving plates, those masterpieces of criminal craftsmanship, were removed from the presses and melted down in industrial furnaces. The metal ran liquid and formless, destroying forever the tools that had created such perfect forgeries. The special paper, the carefully formulated ink, the reference materials and chemical formulas, all of it was systematically destroyed. The destruction was not panicked or hasty. It was methodical, almost ceremonial. Every document related to Operation Dollar was pulled from filing cabinets and fed into incinerators. Photographs, correspondence, technical specifications, financial records. They all turned to ash under the watchful eyes of OGPU officers who understood that loose ends could be lethal. The men and women who had worked on the project were debriefed, their memories harvested for any operational lessons, and then quietly reassigned to other duties in distant locations where they would never again work together or discuss what they had done. Some of the conspirators were less fortunate.
The couriers who had transported the counterfeit bills to Berlin, the intermediaries who had dealt with Sass and Martini, the émigré agents who had moved between worlds. These were the vulnerable links in the chain. Some disappeared into the Gulag system, sent to labor camps in Siberia where their knowledge would die with them. Others suffered more immediate fates, accidents that were not quite accidents, sudden illnesses that were not quite natural. The Soviet state took care of its own secrets with ruthless efficiency. The international community watched this performance with varying degrees of skepticism. American authorities knew they were being lied to, but proving it conclusively was another matter. The evidence from Berlin was suggestive, but not definitive. It showed that Sass and Martini had laundered counterfeit currency, but the direct connection to Moscow remained murky, buried under layers of cutouts and intermediaries. Without access to Soviet territory, without the ability to interview witnesses or examine facilities, Western investigators could only point fingers and make accusations that the Kremlin could easily dismiss. The Soviet strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. Deny everything, destroy the evidence, and wait for the scandal to fade. They understood that international outrage has a short attention span, especially when the world was sliding toward economic depression and had more immediate concerns than a counterfeiting operation that had already been shut down. The Kremlin calculated, correctly, that without smoking gun proof, the accusations would eventually be filed away as another Cold War myth, another unverifiable story about Soviet skullduggery. Stalin himself never publicly addressed the matter. He did not need to. The denial machine operated without his direct involvement, spinning out propaganda and counteraccusations with practiced ease. In private meetings, he may have been furious about the operation's exposure, or he may have been satisfied that it had succeeded for as long as it did. History offers no clear answer, only silence and the cold satisfaction of a man who understood that in geopolitics, what you can prove matters more than what is true. By summer, the crisis had passed. The counterfeit bills were being pulled from circulation. Sass and Martini faced trial in Germany, and the Soviet Union continued to trade with the West as if nothing had happened. The operation was over, but the lie would endure for decades, neither fully admitted nor fully disproven, existing in that shadowy space where conspiracy meets history. 7 years passed before the truth finally emerged from the shadows, and it came not from investigators or journalists, but from a man who had helped build the machine and then fled from it in terror. His name was Alexander Orlov, and in the summer of 1937, he was a general in the NKVD, the successor to the OGPU, a man who had spent 2 decades serving Soviet intelligence in operations across Europe and America. He knew secrets that could topple governments, expose networks, and rewrite the hidden history of the Soviet Union. And he knew that knowing those secrets had become a death sentence. Stalin's great purge was consuming the very apparatus that had served him so faithfully.
Old Bolsheviks, intelligence officers, military commanders. They were being arrested by the thousands, dragged into basement cells, forced to confess to imaginary crimes before being shot. Orlov watched his colleagues disappear one by one, summoned back to Moscow on false pretenses, never to be seen again. He understood the pattern, recognized the signs. His turn was coming. In July, while stationed in Spain during the Civil War, he received a telegram ordering him to report to a ship in the Mediterranean for urgent consultations. It was the same summons that had preceded the disappearance of so many others. Orlov made a choice that few Soviet officers had the courage to make. He chose life over loyalty. With his wife and daughter, he fled Spain and eventually made his way to North America, disappearing into the vastness of the continent. He sent a letter to Stalin, a message that was both a plea and a threat. He promised to remain silent about what he knew, to live quietly and cause no trouble as long as he and his family were left alive. In exchange for that silence, he would not reveal the operations, the networks, the secrets that could damage Soviet intelligence for decades. It was a standoff, a Mexican standoff between a defector and a dictator, and for a time, both sides kept their word. But silence has a shelf life, and by the late 1940s, with Stalin's death approaching and the Cold War intensifying, Orlov began to reconsider his position. He was aging, his health was declining, and he worried that his knowledge would die with him. More importantly, he realized that the Soviet Union he had served no longer existed. It had been devoured by the paranoia and brutality of the system he had helped create. In 1953, after Stalin's death, Orlov made contact with American intelligence agencies and agreed to share what he knew. The debriefing sessions were extraordinary. Orlov sat across from FBI agents and congressional investigators, chain-smoking cigarettes and speaking in accented but fluent English, unspooling story after story of Soviet espionage, sabotage, and financial manipulation. And among those stories, buried in the avalanche of revelations, was the confirmation of Operation Dollar. Orlov had not been directly involved in the counterfeiting scheme, but he had been senior enough to know about it, to have seen reports, to have heard discussions among his superiors. He spoke of the secret printing facilities, the recruitment of master engravers, the distribution networks through Berlin and into America. More damning still, he confirmed what Western investigators had long suspected but could never prove. Stalin himself had approved and overseen the operation. The General Secretary had not delegated this to subordinates and forgotten about it. He had been actively involved, demanding updates, inspecting samples of the counterfeit bills, insisting on perfection. It was Stalin's operation, Stalin's crime, and Stalin's triumph for as long as it lasted. Orlov's testimony transformed the counterfeiting scandal from an unverified conspiracy theory into documented historical fact. The American authorities listened with a mixture of vindication and frustration. Vindication because Orlov confirmed what they had believed all along, that the USSR had engaged in state-sponsored counterfeiting as an act of economic warfare. Frustration because the revelation came decades too late to do anything about it. The operation was long finished, the evidence had been destroyed, and Stalin was dead. There would be no prosecutions, no diplomatic consequences, no accountability. The truth had emerged, but only as a footnote to history. Orlov's revelations were published in articles and books throughout the 1950s and 60s, read by specialists and largely ignored by the general public. The story of Operation Dollar became one of many tales of Soviet skullduggery filed away in archives alongside accounts of espionage networks, assassination plots, and propaganda campaigns. It was true, it was documented, but it had the quality of something unreal, a conspiracy so audacious that it seemed more like fiction than history. Yet Orlov's voice carried weight precisely because of who he had been. This was not a disgruntled émigré making wild accusations, not a political opportunist spinning propaganda. This was a man who had been inside the machine, who had operated at the highest levels of Soviet intelligence, who had every reason to remain silent, but chose instead to speak. His testimony bridged the gap between rumor and fact, between what people suspected and what could be proven. And in doing so, he ensured that Operation Dollar would not be forgotten, even if it could never be fully understood. In the Soviet Union, there was an unspoken rule that everyone understood, but no one dared articulate. Those who know the state's deepest secrets become the secrets themselves. The engravers, chemists, and technicians who had created Operation Dollar were living violations of security, walking repositories of knowledge that could never be allowed to circulate freely. They had saved the Soviet economy with their skills, had enabled Stalin's industrialization through their criminal genius, and for that success, they would pay a price that none of them had anticipated when they first accepted the assignment. The disappearances began quietly in the months following the Berlin raid and the exposure of the operation. An engraver who had reproduced Benjamin Franklin's portrait with such precision that it fooled American experts failed to report to work one morning. His neighbors heard nothing unusual, saw no struggle, noticed only that his apartment remained dark and silent. When his family made inquiries, they were told he had been transferred to a project in the Far East and would not be returning. The same story, with minor variations, was repeated for others. A chemist vanished from his laboratory. A printing technician was seen boarding a train to Siberia and never arrived at his supposed destination. These were not arrests in the traditional sense, with formal charges and show trials. These were erasures, the systematic removal of inconvenient people from the fabric of existence. Some met more immediate fates. A courier who had transported counterfeit bills to Berlin was found dead in his apartment, the official cause listed as heart failure, though he was only 38 years old and had been in perfect health. Another technician died in what was reported as a factory accident, crushed by machinery in a printing facility that had nothing to do with currency production. The accidents were plausible, mundane enough not to raise suspicions, yet frequent enough to establish a pattern for those who knew where to look. The NKVD was cleaning house, ensuring that no one who understood the technical details of the operation could ever be questioned, bribed, or tempted to defect. The lucky ones ended up in the Gulag, the vast network of labor camps that stretched across the frozen wastes of Siberia and Kazakhstan. There, men who had once worked in heated laboratories and sophisticated workshops found themselves breaking rocks in temperatures that could freeze flesh in minutes. Their skills meant nothing in those places. An engraver who could reproduce the finest details of American currency was just another prisoner, Just another number, sentenced to years of hard labor for crimes that were never specified. If they survived their sentences, and many did not, they emerged as broken men, too traumatized and exhausted to remember clearly what they had done in those secret facilities beneath Moscow. The state's logic was brutal but coherent. The knowledge these men possessed was too dangerous to allow them to live free. What if one of them defected? What if foreign intelligence services managed to recruit them? What if they got drunk in a bar and boasted about their role in fooling the American banking system? The risk was unacceptable. Better to eliminate the risk entirely, to treat the technical specialists as expendable components that had served their purpose and now needed to be disposed of safely.
It was the same calculus that governed much of Soviet governance. People were resources to be used and discarded when they became liabilities. There were exceptions, of course. A handful of the most senior figures in the operation, those who had connections to powerful patrons within the NKVD, managed to survive by being transferred to other secret projects where their skills could continue to serve the state. They traded one prison for another, spending the rest of their careers locked away in closed facilities, working on classified operations, living under constant surveillance. They survived, but at the cost of their freedom, their families, and any hope of a normal life. They had created perfect forgeries of American currency, and in return, they became forgeries themselves. Ersatz human beings, stripped of identity and agency, existing only to serve the apparatus that had consumed them. The irony was not lost on those few who understood what had happened. The operation had been designed to exploit capitalism's trust in paper currency, to show that money was nothing more than ink and fiber, that value could be created from nothing if the lie was convincing enough. But the same principle applied to the men who had created those forgeries. In Stalin's system, human beings were just as disposable as counterfeit bills, just as easily erased when they became inconvenient. The artists who had printed false dollars discovered that they themselves were false, temporary constructs that served a purpose and then disappeared without leaving a trace. By the time Orlov revealed the truth about Operation Dollar in the 1950s, most of the people who had worked on it were already dead or lost in the Gulag system. Their names were never recorded in official histories, their contributions never acknowledged, their fates never investigated. They became ghosts, whispers of a conspiracy that had briefly succeeded before consuming its own creators.
The Soviet state had saved itself with their talents, and then it had devoured them to protect its secrets. That was the final lesson of Operation Dollar. In the game of state-sponsored crime, there are no winners, only survivors and victims. The plates were melted, the paper burned, the evidence scattered like ash across the Soviet Union. By the end of the 1930s, Operation Dollar existed only in fragments, whispered rumors, classified documents locked in Western archives, and the fading memories of a few survivors who dared not speak. The official history, both Soviet and American, treated it as an embarrassing footnote, a scandal that was better forgotten than analyzed. The world moved on to other crises, other wars, other deceptions. But the knowledge, once created, can never be truly destroyed. In the decades that followed,
American authorities occasionally encountered counterfeit $100 bills of extraordinary quality. Forgeries so sophisticated that they seemed to echo the craftsmanship of Stalin's operation. During the Cold War, these bills appeared sporadically, always in small quantities, always untraceable to their source. Intelligence analysts noted the similarities, but could never establish definitive connections. Were these the work of Soviet successor operations, continuing the tradition that Stalin had established? Or had the knowledge leaked somehow, passed from the dead hands of purged engravers to new generations of criminals and state actors? By the 1980s and 90s, a new generation of counterfeit dollars emerged, nicknamed supernotes or superdollars by the American authorities who discovered them. These forgeries were even more sophisticated than Stalin's originals, incorporating security features that had been added to genuine currency over the decades. They appeared in circulation through channels connected to North Korea, Iran, and organized crime syndicates operating in East Asia. The technical quality suggested state sponsorship, access to high-level printing technology, and expertise that could only come from decades of accumulated knowledge. The ghost of Operation Dollar seemed to have found new hosts. American investigators studying the superdollars noticed something unsettling. The techniques used to create them bore striking similarities to the methods pioneered by Soviet counterfeiters in the 1930s. The paper composition, the ink chemistry, the approach to replicating microprinting and security threads, all of it suggested a lineage, a tradition passed down through shadowy channels from one rogue state to another. Had Stalin's operation truly ended? Or had it simply evolved, adapting to new technologies and new geopolitical circumstances? The question remained unanswered, buried under layers of classified intelligence and diplomatic silence. What Operation Dollar proved ultimately was something that economists and philosophers have long understood but rarely articulated. Money is a shared hallucination. It has value only because we collectively agree that it does, because we trust the symbols printed on paper or stored in digital ledgers. Stalin's counterfeiters understood this truth at a visceral level. They demonstrated that if the illusion is perfect enough, if the forgery is indistinguishable from the original, then the distinction between real and fake becomes meaningless. The American industrialists who accepted counterfeit dollars in exchange for machinery did not lose value because the bills were fake. They lost value because they discovered the bills were fake. The deception worked until it was exposed, and in that gap between reality and perception, the Soviet Union built its industrial future. The deeper truth is even more unsettling. Every currency, in a sense, is a kind of counterfeit. The paper itself is worthless. Its value derives entirely from the authority of the state that issues it and the collective faith of those who accept it. Stalin's crime was not creating fake dollars. It was revealing the arbitrary nature of all money, the thin thread of trust upon which the entire global economy dangles. And once that revelation is made, once people understand how fragile the system truly is, the knowledge cannot be unlearned. Today, decades after Stalin's death, decades after the plates were melted and the engravers disappeared into unmarked graves, the echo of Operation Dollar still resonates. Every time a perfect counterfeit appears, every time a rogue state demonstrates the ability to mimic another nation's currency, the old questions resurface. How do we know what is real? Who decides what has value? And what happens when the lie becomes so convincing that it functionally replaces the truth? These are not just historical curiosities. They are questions that haunt the digital age, where cryptocurrency and electronic transactions have made money even more abstract, even more dependent on shared belief and nothing more. The ghost of Stalin's dollars, it seems, is still circulating somewhere in the machinery of global finance, a reminder that the most successful lies are the ones we never quite detect, the ones that become indistinguishable from reality itself. And perhaps that was Stalin's greatest triumph, not the temporary success of the operation, but the permanent seed of doubt it planted in the foundations of the system he sought to destroy. If you found this story as disturbing as I intended it to be, explore the other videos on this channel. History has more secrets than you imagine, and some of them are still unfolding. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think Operation Dollar truly ended, or is it still operating in some form today? And if this investigation into Soviet financial warfare opened your eyes to something you did not know, give this video a like. The truth deserves to be seen.